A founder I was coaching was telling me how he was grinding his teeth and having acid reflux. His body was clearly sending signals. So I asked him, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your stress? I thought he'd say 7 or 8, and he said 4. When I pointed out the disconnect, he said, as if it were some law of nature, but isn't that the price of success? When founders say things like that, it makes me want to scream, not at them, but at the system that taught them that. Because there's a reason founders think this way. Harry Stebbings, one of Europe's most well-known VCs and founder of a $400 million fund, told Business Insider, "I only invest in ruthless psychopaths." And he's not the only one. The entire VC world and Western society in general glorifies this archetype, the obsessive, never satisfied, always on founder who treats rest as weakness and stress as proof of ambition. And most founders have internalized this so deeply, they don't even question it. By the end of this video, you'll have a different way of thinking about what it actually takes to succeed and a diagnostic to understand what's driving you. Because most burnout advice doesn't get to the root cause, the real reason founders get stuck in the suffering loop. And it's costing them. Because when the founder is driven by fear, it permeates the company. It shapes how your team makes decisions, how they treat each other, what they're afraid to say out loud, all of which lowers your chances of succeeding even more. Building a company requires suffering. That's just what it takes. I've seen this belief throughout my years of coaching over 1,000 founders. And if they're not seeing the results they want, it must be because they haven't worked or suffered enough. That's why most burnout advice doesn't work. It addresses the symptoms, not the belief. So get better sleep, meditate, take a vacation. And those things matter, of course, but if your underlying belief is that suffering is the price of success, you'll be back in your familiar patterns 3 days after you get home from Italy. So where does this belief come from? It's deeply ingrained in our achievement-oriented culture where we're conditioned to think we need to prove our worth, our value. We don't deserve success if we haven't worked hard enough for it. So the fear isn't just, what if I fail? It's, what if I don't deserve this? And that gets compounded by a VC culture that essentially asks, how much do you want this? Show me. That fear is what keeps you in survival mode, constantly scanning for threats, not opportunities. That's when you start to overanalyze, micromanage, make decisions from anxiety rather than clarity. And in that mode, you end up asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, am I working hard enough? A better question is, am I in the right state to produce the results I want? So how do you know what state you're actually in? That's why I created the Founder State Matrix. It measures 2 things: what's driving you, vision or fear, and the momentum you're generating. Not as a judgment, just as a way of diagnosing what state you're actually in. So there are 4 states, and they're fluid. You could pass through all of them in the same day. So as I walk through each one, see if you can identify which state you've been in the last 2 hours. The first one is never enough. One of my CEO clients had always felt, since childhood, he had something to prove. And even after he had built a 100 million plus business in just a few short years, he still felt like he needed to prove he was worthy to be a CEO, that he could be running a bigger business. That pressure drove results, but it also drove unrealistic deadlines, constant dissatisfaction with his team's progress, forcing decisions on people rather than getting their buy-in. And eventually they started to push back, and it almost led to a mass exodus. So high output driven by fear. Stress feels like proof you care. This state produces results, but they're less and less satisfying, and the goalpost just keeps moving down the field. The next mode is running on empty. After weeks of intense travel, back-to-back meetings, and fear of missing payroll, one founder I worked with finally closed a funding round. But then her co-founder said they were thinking it was time to move on. She was exhausted, but still showing up, still trying to problem solve, But she'd been in fight or flight mode for months, spending her time on things she didn't enjoy, dreading having to deal with people problems, and unable to get to the product development work that actually mattered. So you still care deeply, you're not willing to give up, but the tank is empty. There's no momentum, just the dread of everything you're forcing yourself to do. That brings us to in the trenches. One founder I worked with was incredibly busy, diving into data, jumping into team conversations, troubleshooting pricing strategy. By any measure, he was working hard, but he wasn't where he should have been, up above, steering the ship and determining the long-term direction. And the longer he stayed in the trenches, the more his team waited for him. They stopped developing their own judgment. The dependency was invisible until he wasn't available and everything stalled. So he knew he needed to make the transition. He told me, I understand it intellectually. I'm not an operator anymore, but my Pavlovian brain still wants to check boxes. Yes, you're driven by vision, but you're still operating like it's the early years. That activity to momentum ratio is off. And the longer you stay there, the harder the transition becomes. So the final state is the flow zone. The flow zone is when the balance is right. You have challenges, but you feel capable of tackling them. They excite you rather than overwhelm you. You can focus. You're not constantly pulled in 10 directions by anxiety or doubt. I saw this with a CEO who had built a $100 million business. When he stopped trying to prove he was worthy to be a CEO and focused on being present with the people he was building with, something shifted. And he told me, I can build things by being caring, inspiring, and calm. And that shifts entire mountains. So same person, same drive, different fuel. And just to be clear, the flow zone is not the absence of fear, doubt, or uncertainty. You can still feel all of that. But when you're driven by vision, those feelings open up into possibility and excitement rather than closing down into avoidance and control. You're excited by the challenges rather than defeated by them. So what gets in the way of most founders reaching this zone and then staying there? That's what I cover in the High EQ Founder newsletter. I'll put the link in the description. So here's what I've seen. Most founders assume suffering is necessary and they never stop to question it. So just diagnosing what's driving you, fear or vision, can be more powerful than any productivity system or burnout fix. I know we celebrate the founders who made it through sheer obsession and hustle and force of will. We don't see the ones who didn't, unless there's a Netflix special. Survivor bias makes fear-driven leadership look like the winning formula, but eventually it hits a ceiling when you can't address the important conflicts. You have breakdowns in important relationships. Vision-driven founders access a whole other level. I've seen it firsthand. Founders who shifted from proving themselves to tapping into this kind of joy and love of building with others. The difference in what they're able to build and who they're able to build it with is profound. If you're not convinced and you want to know more about what survival mode does to your cognitive functioning and how to get out of it, I'll link that video. And if you want to go deeper on all of this, subscribe to the High EQ Founder newsletter, link in the description. That's where I go deeper every week on the frameworks and the tools that help you lead from vision rather than fear. Until next time, I'm rooting for you.